Thank you very much, and thank you to the words from our honoured guest. You'll have to forgive me a little bit. I can't see, so I can't have a written script before me, so things are liable to get a little bit disjointed. But I'm very happy to have the opportunity to talk, because it's a very unique relationship, particularly this gathering we've got here today. It happened quite, not by big efforts on anyone's part, but by four of our sailors who got together and decided they'd ride across to America, make contact with the survivors and see what could be done. And they were in a certain amount of trouble for money to go across to America. And they worked their way around as much as they could, but they weren't successful until finally they spoke to Tony Horton. And Tony Horton came up with the fares for them to go over to America. And so these two associations got born. And it's quite unique and very rewarding. But Tony, as usual, came to the front and has been part of this organisation ever since, a major part. And I'd like to thank him for what he's done over these past 3 days. Tony, you've been a star. I said today it'll probably be a little bit disjointed, but I'm really talking more about the wives and the families, because when that collision occurred, we were quite a long way away. And most times when something like that happens, we go home afterwards in a few days and we get the comfort to explain our troubles to our wives and families. This wasn't possible because we were up north in Singapore, and it took us about 3 months before we could get back down and our families could be seen. In that time, of course, a lot of people, you'd normally go back with your feeling terrible with trauma and worries, and get it sorted out with families, and you'll all get back to normal. But this wasn't possible. I was fortunate in that my wife managed to rack together a few cash, and she went to the Naval Board and said, I want to go north to support my husband, and they wouldn't approve it. So she went to the Prime Minister with the same request. She wouldn't get approved. They didn't give her approval. Said, no one's allowed up there, you've got to stay back. So she went down to the airport and bought a ticket and flew up, leaving 2 children behind, Brian, one of them, being looked after by friends. And as a result, because of her presence up there, I had a pretty easy ride. But what she managed to do was bring out all of everything that was going wrong in the inquiry and everything, and she sort of brought it to light, and we owe her a great deal. I think the wives really have a rotten time, and I think after this accident, everything seemed to go wrong, quite apart from the accident itself, because my court-martial and the sort of bad publicity and my resignation and so on added to everything to leave us all with a sense of shame, when in actual fact you should all have been regarded as heroes, because you had been doing heroic stuff up there. But no, it was thanks to politics, we were left with this sense of shame for a long time, for 40-something years, until, unbeknown to anybody us. My son Brian had been feeling the same sort of thing, and was every year, he'd write to the existing government and say that it was a miscarriage of justice that should be corrected. We didn't know about this, but eventually, after 43 years, the government and the Naval Board finally agreed that it had been a miscarriage of justice. And I think I felt at that moment everything was lifted off, and our sense of shame could go, and we could get that big sense of pride again. And my only wish would be that we could be leading you down the streets of Sydney as heroes, because heroes you were, and heroes of course you are. So I really feel that so many of our guys sitting here today, our sailors, are still suffering quite a bit of trauma, at least 30 or 40% of them are. And I don't think the wives really know why they're feeling this trauma, because by the time they got back, it was all bottled up, and they went on suffering. I'd like to sort of try to explain to the wives what happened on that night, without sort of trying to go into enormous detail. But just go back and think about it a little bit. On that night, nice, beautiful sky, clear, no real wind. And these two ships, unfortunately, collided. Now, backtracking a little bit, when I was a kid, as a midshipman, in my first ship, whenever we went to sea, the captain always made sure that we, at least on one section of the trip, the ship's company was put over the side to swim. And it's an interesting experience, very different to swimming in a swimming pool. When you go and swim in 1,000 feet of water, it's frightening and it's worrisome until you get used to it. And so I took that lesson with me throughout my career. It stood me in good stead when we were sunk in the Mediterranean in the 40s. And it stood me in stood us all in good stead when we had that collision. Because our guys, without any hesitation, went over the side to rescue those who were struggling. And I remember, as part of my trauma, which is with me day and night, as we collided, there was a huge explosion as the boilers broke up in front of us. Huge explosion ahead of us, noise and crash. And one poor American sailor landed up on the deck of the carrier. He was pretty quickly taken down below and into the sick bay, and he survived, fortunately, after a long period of sickness. But I then remember going, as the ship was, to look over to my port side, you could see the front end of the Evans turning over and sinking. And I went over to the starboard side and leaned over the side of the bridge, and I could see the after half of the Evans drifting down on the starboard side. And there were two sailors in the water trying to stay afloat, because I was going full astern at the time, so the wash was going back and giving them a pretty difficult time. And as they drifted by, I stopped the starboard engine so that they wouldn't get chewed up in the screws. And as a result, the ship swung, of course, its stern swung across a bit, and got close to the back half. And I've got to give him credit for a great deal of good seamanship in managing to get the two ships together. It was nothing to do with me. It was all you guys on deck that took it into your own hands to secure that ship, that half of the ship alongside, and to get survivors off. A number of you here remember that, because a number of you here went over and got the sails off that half of the ship. And before we cast that half loose, when they found there was no one left on board, and we were all clear. That was a tremendous effort, and from then on, of course, you went over the side so quickly without any fear and worry and fear. It was Bob Burns, who was our clearance diver, was the first who dived off the top deck straight into the water when he saw somebody struggling and not likely to survive. He went down without a hesitation, and I'm glad to say he got the high decoration that he did. But so many of you then, the boats were away in seconds, and all away, and having dropped all those sort of floaters, and all you guys, a lot of you, then went over the side also to recover other people. And it was a tremendous effort and a tremendous gallantry which couldn't be recognised. But thanks to Brian, who'd been complaining about these problems for years as I was going, the trauma that I was going through, and the government finally decided, and the Naval Board followed, to say that there had been a miscarriage of justice, and thanks to Brian, all was sort of forgiven and forgotten. So I reckon we ought to now march down the streets with all your heroes to be recognised properly. I really am so happy. And of course, I hope the wives can sort of learn that it was a pretty torrid time, and they had good reason to have their worries and troubles. And I'm glad to see that a lot of them been sorted out. So thank you guys. It's been a tremendous day, or tremendous few days. Thank you again, Tony, and thank you so much. If I haven't spoken to any of you, which I really wanted to speak to every one of you that came into this day on these occasions, I'd love to make contact before you depart. So thank you so much again, and could I ask you to stand for a moment of silence? We would have 1 minute of silence in memory of our fallen comrades. Thank you.